Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. Today we are reacting to the Premier League fixture list release. Huge news with how the season is going to play out, and it is going to be broken up by a very disruptive World Cup. But not only is there a disruption, but Ben, you've actually been quoted in many kind of newspapers this week saying that it is going to create a perfect injury storm. I mean, first of all, what did you mean by this?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, a word that's often been bandied around in recent times is unprecedented. And this Winter World Cup certainly is that. An international tournament on the biggest stage, shoehorned between a domestic campaign. So how players will react, respond, we simply don't know. But, coming off the back of heavily disrupted pre-seasons, the European Championships, COVID, the pandemic, going all the way back to Project Restart, this culmination of a lack of rest, and all of these other influencing factors around the game could potentially come together to create this perfect injury storm that simply sees, the injury rates and incidence of players spike, and go off the charts.
Were you annoyed as well that there's continued internationals over this summer, because we do have the season starting just a tad bit early? It doesn't seem to make that much difference in the grand scheme of things, and we'll go into that. But we've seen Nations League games being played, England players being pushed to the edge once again for basically glorified friendlies.
Look, I think the harsh reality of the situation is some clubs, some players will be invited back for pre-season training, before the beginning of July. That isn't very long. We're talking about a very quick turnaround. And, forget about the physicalities of playing the game at the highest level after, everything that's went on prior to this. But psychologically, you need to switch off. You need to refresh. You need to recalibrate. You need, that time away from the game to ensure that, when you do return, you're in tip-top physical condition and you've got the tools and you're able to get through, that campaign, like I say, which is a World Cup tournament, shoehorned, bang, in the middle of what, inherently would be a very busy period of domestic football.
So let's look at these fixtures then. The season has been brought forward by about 7 days, and we do see a break after the 12th of November. That's when the last fixtures are before this World Cup, which then sees us return on the 26th of December this year. But it has only seen the season brought forward by 7 days. And if you compare the kind of block of the first 100 days of the Premier League, there's going to be at least 5 extra games in that period alone. I mean, we're seeing a whole season and a World Cup being fit into this, the time frame of one whole season. This is going to get dangerous for a lot of players, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and you're just referencing domestic games there. So those players or those sides involved in European competition, Champions League, Europa League, what have you, they will also feature a condensed schedule. So on top of those 5 additional games that we had compared to, say, 2020 to 21, where we've seen around 11, sort of 12 domestic fixtures, we have those additional ones, and you have that European games as well, and then we only have one international break, which will be in and around, after those in game week 8, where typically we would see it after game week 3 and game week 7, and then you'd have that third one in November. Just simply we don't have that. And it just seems as if everything is being crammed in. Players will be overplayed, overworked, and certainly in terms of managing load, managing strategy, rotation, managers, the sports science departments, the medical teams, the coaches will have to be a lot more aware of the physical demands that are being placed on the players.
So let's move to, I guess, the important questions for football fans, those who bet, and also for Fantasy Premier League as well. In terms of it, some people will be selfishly inclined to think, how's this going to affect me? So first and foremost, Do you reckon there's going to be a lot of rotation through the season, maybe record highs in terms of that? We always talk about Pep Guardiola. We've seen Klopp manage his team really, really well in terms of getting the most out of them and lowering incidents of injuries. But is this going to happen across the Premier League? Is it going to be really hard to actually predict 11s going forward?
I mean, look, it's certainly going to impact, and we have obviously the 5 substitutes possibility, of next season as well. So that's certainly something that's going to be utilised. Maybe some managers more than others. A lot of it's going to come down to the strength of the squad and the depth of the squad and how many fixtures and how many competitions those teams are fighting on several different fronts. We've seen with Jurgen Klopp last season, he set his stall out very early in terms of the number of players that he involved, either rotation from one game to the next to substitution and giving those players minutes. Now, during the early part of that campaign, what that helped was in the latter stages of the season, you had players who were able to transition from the fringes of the squad, those on the peripherals of that starting level, come in and start and almost seamlessly carry on that winning process. And a prime example would be Liverpool after that FA Cup final. They had that very quick turnaround where they travelled to St Mary's, who weren't in great form, but certainly a difficult game. Jurgen Klopp made changes to 9 outfield players. Konate was the only outfield player to retain his place. And of course, Liverpool kept their title challenge alive with a 2-1 win at St Mary's.
So I guess, you've mentioned it here for the Premier League specifically, 5 substitutes will come in that new role. Do you think that will play a role at all at slightly helping the situation, or is even 5 substitutes that allowance not really going to make a difference because of how impactful and how awful this season is going to be?
I mean, it certainly will help. Anything that will help to sort of mitigate risk and manage load. Ultimately, those fatigue-related injuries, muscle tears, strains, so on and so forth, soft tissue injuries, that's going to help. And ultimately managers and coaches can make decisions, and it's not maybe so much as a gamble. If you've got 5 changes that potentially you can make, that's a lot more flexibility in terms of that starting 11 and who comes in and when players come off. But the difficulty is maybe those smaller teams, or certainly if you're picking up 1 or 2 injuries, squads become stretched. We know the vast sums of money involved in playing in that top flight. Ultimately, you're going to be judged on results, and you can't understate, the influence of those stakeholders. So yes, with the best will and the best intentions, ultimately you're going to want your best 11 on the pitch. And then also you have to consider the fans and the supporters who are attending these games. It's a lot of money, to go to these matches now. And, you're going to want to see the best players. You want to see the best starting 11 for that fixture. So, there's a lot of considerations, and it's a very fine balance.
One of the big concerns is going to be what's going to happen to players who aren't playing at the tournament or maybe come back early. Is there a high risk of deconditioning there as well?
Yeah, so I mean, there's 2 facets specifically to this. So we've done a little bit of a deep dive on those players who are involved in the latter stages of the Euro, and this followed on from a study that we conducted after the World Cup. Now, what we saw was, to get baseline figures, we took a 2-year rolling average, both in terms of injury incidence, availability, minutes played, and all across a number of performance metrics. And what we found was that a high percentage, around 67% of players who were involved in the latter stages of the Euros within that England squad actually, suffered a downturn in performance, and significant to a point. Now, we used the Who Scored index to try and standardize that. So we've seen a significant downturn, and like I say, in a number of performance outputs, but we also seen a higher number of injury incidents. We saw a longer return to play, and we also seen a dramatic reduction in the number of minutes played by these players. A few of those stand out: the Marcus Rashfords, the Calvin Phillips, the Dominic Calvert-Lewins of this world.
And the problem is, as well, is during the training, during this downtime season, people might think, oh, well, we're talking about players getting fatigue and not getting enough rest. Well, those players that don't go to the tournament might have an advantage because they're being rested. They're not going to be played. But the problem is the deconditioning, isn't it, Ben, that they cannot replicate in a training session, even if they play, friendly games to keep some sort of level of fitness. It can never replicate the cut and thrust of a proper competitive Premier League game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking around about a 6-week break, from that November to the fixtures reconvening on Boxing Day, which inherently we know is a congested fixture period. And, it's difficult to manage anyway. How players and squads and coaches are going to look after their players to make sure and trying to ensure that they mitigate that risk, lower that risk of setback and injury during this period is going to be difficult. On top of that, you have those players as well. We mentioned the likes of the Dominic Calvert-Lewins of this world who went to the Euros, who were part of that squad, but didn't play a lot of competitive minutes. Now, again, you're not having the same type of intensive training sessions when you're away at these tournaments. So, in effect, they are coming back deconditioned and expecting them to come back to one of, the most dynamic and high intensity leagues in the world, then you've got that recipe for that perfect storm that I mentioned at the top of the show.
Yeah, and you're not the only person saying it. FIFPro has actually called for a dramatic change to the schedule. They've described lots of players being at serious risk of injury. So one of the things that we do kind of see, especially towards the end of the seasons, when players are fatigued or they don't have a lot to play for, we see anomalous results. So, coupled with high risk of injuries, high fatigue, high levels of deconditioned players, could we be seeing one of the most anomalous Premier League seasons on record? We saw Pep kind of manage through the COVID and lift the Premier League, but even then, there was a lot of crazy results that people could not have predicted at all.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, we watch it with bated breath as to what happens. But, just in terms of, again, that injury instance, if we look back to last season, after game week 31, that international break, Watford, for example, seen more than a third of those injuries occur just in that one block. However, on the flip side, and I mentioned Liverpool and Jurgen Klopp, although, when we look at that first and second half of the season, we've seen an increase in that second half of competitive load exposure by around about a third, so around about 32-33%. However, in terms of time loss injury, and thanks to that management, thanks to that rotation, we actually seen a massive downturn in the number of reported incidents of 43% of injuries. So it just goes to show, with the right management and a little bit of luck, then hopefully, you can continue to win games and, minimize the risk of losing players, if players are managed in the right way.
One question, again, this might not be a clever question. This might be counterintuitive again, but people will ask this. Could this at all benefit smaller clubs who will have less players going to the tournament? They might be able to keep these players fitter for longer. There is that element of deconditioning, but at the same time, there's not that higher risk of injury, or is there?
I mean, look, we're just focusing mainly on load and fitness and that competitive edge. But then you also need to consider the change in climate, change of environment, change in diet, nutrition, different structured training, different demands on the body, different physicalities required at a national and domestic level. So all of that, culminates and comes together and will influence a player in terms of, one, their availability, and two, their performance outputs. So those players who maybe remain and have a more stable, typical, rhythm of training and environment, potentially, yes, could benefit from that more consistent approach, continually throughout the course of the campaign.
So I guess one of the final things is this going to affect the way that you play Fantasy Premier League? Is this going to affect the way that you bet on the Premier League this season? Should there be a focus on backing players that aren't at the World Cup or those that do? Do you play with a big squad? I mean, as well with betting, is it going to maybe put you off maybe putting a flurry at the weekend?
I think, what you need to do is you need to make informed decisions, and you need to try and, mitigate any risk, mitigate the downside. Ultimately, for somebody like me who likes to maybe go for the more oddball or erratic choice, or those players on a less ownership, maybe those players who are flying a little bit under the radar, then, there's a big ceiling on those players, because they could be coming at the forefront of managers' thinking and coaches' understanding. Like I say, just because you've got that level of consistency. But on the flip side, if England, for example, were to win the World Cup, then you're having a squad and a group of players who are coming back, with lots of confidence. They're going to be flying high on a crest of a wave. They're going to want to go out there and prove themselves and show why they're the best in the world. And so, I think all things considered, it's going to be difficult. As with what we've seen with COVID for the last few seasons, expect the unexpected and don't be too surprised if it actually comes to fruition.
And this is why you need to stay subscribed to our channel as well, so that you can make the informed decisions that you talked about, Ben, and you can mitigate risk, because we'll be talking through all the preseason, all through the season as well, up to the World Cup and beyond, telling you what to do, how to manage your squads if you're playing Fantasy Premier League, if you're betting on the Premier League as well, just to help you make those wise decisions, because it is all about the information that you get. And we have no rumour, we have no misinformation, we just give you the full science-based facts here. So we will see you again very, very soon. We hope that you enjoyed this deep dive into the fixtures and how this may affect the Premier League season ahead. And for now, we wish you the best of luck and the best of health. See you very soon.